possible to transport all the three types of materials through a single system? Yes, it is possible by a system called circulatory system. Children, today we will learn about the circulatory system. Circulatory system have some important components. The main features of the circulatory system are heart, blood, blood vessels, lymph and lymphatic vessels. Children, you have learnt about blood in your 9th class. You learnt about heart. Children, today we will learn about the blood vessels. Before going to learn about the blood vessels, let us see the some of the discoveries of the scientist.
In 1574, an Italian doctor, Girolamo Fabrici, was studying the veins in the leg. He noticed that they had small valves in them.
Girolamo Fabrici was the first person who described the membranous folds that he called valves in the interior of veins. If the blood moved in one direction, the valves folded towards the walls of the vessel, so the blood could pass without any trouble. If the blood moved in the opposite direction, the valves closed. So, if the person standing upright also, the valves forces the blood towards the upward direction only, but not downwards. William Harvey was the first person who explained how blood was moved through the body by the heart. Harvey dissected the hearts of dead people and found the valves present between each atrium and ventricle. The valves allow the blood from the atrium to ventricle without any hindrance. Let us see the classical experiment to demonstrate the flow of blood in veins conducted by the William Harvey in early 17th century. Harvey checked that the circulation of blood as though the blood is trying to flow toward the heart and to accumulate just below the block because it simply veins couldn't flow away from the heart. This was true of all veins. In the arteries, the blood bulged on the heart side of any block he put in, as though trying to flow away from the heart but couldn't move in the other direction. So, Harvey concluded that the heart pushed the blood into the arteries and the blood returned by way of veins. In the 1661, after Harvey's death, Marcello Malpighi studied the wings of bats. So, he noticed that finest small arteries and veins were connected by very small blood vessels. So, he called those blood vessels as capillaries. Children, observe the picture here. Smallest arteries and arterioles are connected by small blood vessels are called capillaries. In Latin, capillary means hair because they are very thin like hair. Children, after knowing the discoveries of the scientist, we can state that there are two types of blood vessels. They are arteries and veins. Children, let us see the structure of the arteries and veins. Children, observe the pictures of artery and vein. Here, the artery and vein are essentially have three layers in their walls. They are outer fibrous coat, middle muscle layer and inner endothelium. Here, the arteries are covered by elastic fibrous coat, whereas vein is covered by tough fibrous coat. The muscle layer of the artery is very thick as to accommodate the high pressure of blood and speed of the freshly pumped blood by the heart, whereas the veins have very thin muscle layer because they have very low blood pressure and blood flow also very less. The lumen of the artery is very narrow, whereas the lumen of the vein is very wide. Children, observe one more picture here. The endothelium of the veins double folded to form valves in the veins, because valves acts against the gravitational force to pump the blood into the heart, whereas valves are absent in the artery, because the blood pumped by the heart is pushes into the arteries and the blood from the arteries supplies towards the various body parts. So, there is no force of the gravity. So, the valves are absent, whereas in veins the gravitational force is acting upon the veins. To overcome the gravitational force, the veins are provided with valves. Children, arteries are bright red in color, veins are dark red in color. Arteries are divided into arterioles and capillaries, whereas veins start with venules and ends with vena cava. Arteries perform the main function of the carrying oxygenated blood to the various parts of the body, and the blood pressure is more in the arteries. So, they are located deeply in the body to prevent from any damage occurring, whereas veins are, in veins the blood flows with very low pressure and speed also very low. That is why they are located superficially. Arteries and veins are connected by very fine blood vessels called capillaries. Arteries supply oxygenated blood from heart to the body parts, whereas veins collects deoxygenated blood from body parts to the heart. Children, observe the picture of blood capillary. So, already you know that the arteries and veins are connected by blood capillary. Blood capillaries are the very minute, very fine blood vessels. So, they are made up of single layer of cells. They allow the diffusion of various substances. Children, let us see the structural and functional differences between arteries and veins. Children, observe the first column. Thickness of walls. The arteries are the thick walled vessels, whereas veins are the thin walled vessels. Valves. Valves are absent in artery because there is no effect of gravitational force. Valves are present in veins because they act against the gravity. Capacity to retain shape when blood is absent. Arteries can retain their shape because of the thick muscle layer, whereas the veins collapse because they have very thin muscle layer. Direction of blood flow. Arteries receives blood from the heart and pumps the various organs, whereas the veins collect blood from the body organs and pumped towards the heart. Pressure in the vessel. Arteries have more pressure because the lumen is very narrow, whereas the veins have very low pressure because they have wide lumen. Type of blood transported. Arteries transport oxygenated blood from heart to the various parts of the body. Veins collects deoxygenated blood from the various body parts and pumped into the heart. Type of blood carried by pulmonary artery is deoxygenated blood. Pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood from left ventricle to the lungs, whereas the veins collects oxygenated blood from the lungs and pumped into the left atrium. Children, generally we know that human body contains 5 liters of blood. I think you might be wondered, how does the small heart pumps that much amount of blood? The heart pumps the blood by contraction and relaxation. By contractions and relaxations, the blood pumped by the heart. One contraction and one relaxation of atria and ventricles is called cardiac cycle. Children, generally heart starts beating around 21st day of development in the mother's womb. If the heart stops beating, it leads to the death of a person. To know the function of the heart, let us see cardiac cycle. Children, observe the picture. Let us remind the structure of the heart. Heart is having 4 chambers. Upper chambers are called atria, lower chambers are called ventricles. Atria receives deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, whereas the left atrium receives blood from the lungs through the pulmonary vein. The left ventricle pumps the blood into the aorta. So, imagine all the chambers of the heart are in relaxed state. Now, the blood from the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava flows into the right atrium. From the pulmonary veins, the blood flows into the left atrium. When the atria filled with blood, they start contracting and they send blood to the ventricles. When the ventricles are filled with blood, they start contracting and the blood from the right ventricle flows into the pulmonary artery, whereas the left ventricle trying to flow into the aorta. When the ventricles start contracting, atria start relaxing. When the ventricles start contracting, the blood from the ventricles trying to flow towards the blood vessels. From the right ventricle, the blood pumped into the pulmonary artery, whereas the from left ventricles trying to flow toward the atria, but the walls which are present between the atria and ventricles closed. Then we can listen a sharp sound of the heart called lub. When the ventricles pump the blood into the pulmonary artery and aorta, they start relaxing. When the ventricles start relaxing, the walls which are present between the pulmonary artery and aorta closed to prevent the backward flow of blood. Then we can listen a dull sound of the heart called lub. Now, all the chambers, atria and ventricle, they closed when the blood trying to come back into the atria, whereas the walls which are present in the pulmonary artery and aorta also closed when the blood trying to come back into the ventricles. Actually, the walls prevent the backward flow of the blood. So, we can state that sequential events which are cyclically repeated are called cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle includes an active phase systole and a resting phase diastole of atria and ventricles. The whole process is completed in 0.8 seconds. Hence, the blood pumped into the blood vessels at regular intervals. So, the tissues will not receive blood continuously.
Defined as a sequence of alternating contraction and relaxation of the atria and ventricles in order to pump the blood throughout the body. The phase of contraction is called systole and the phase of relaxation is called diastole. It starts at the beginning of one heartbeat and ends at the beginning of another. Each cardiac cycle has a diastolic phase or diastole and a systolic phase or systole. In a diastolic phase, the heart chambers are in a state of relaxation and fills with blood. In a systolic phase, the heart chambers are contracting and pumps the blood. Both the atria and ventricles undergo alternating states of systole and diastole. In other words, when the atria are in diastole, the ventricles are in systole and vice versa.
Children, when we keep our fingers on the wrist where the artery is passing, we feel the pressure of blood moving in it. This is the pulse. The pulse is nothing but rhythmic dilation of an artery generated by the opening and closing of the aortic valve in the heart. The rate of the pulse will be equal to the number of heartbeats. Stethoscope is used to hear the heartbeat. Children, observe the picture of stethoscope. It is used to hear the heartbeat. In the year 1816, Rene Laennec invented the first stethoscope. Before the discovery of the stethoscope, doctors used to hear the heartbeat by keeping the ear on the chest of the patient. Laennec found that paper tube helps to hear the heartbeat. He used bamboo instead of paper tube to hear the heartbeat. Children, observe the picture. It is the stethoscope which prepared by the Rene Laennec. He used a stethoscope by using paper first. After that, he used bamboo instead of paper. Children, you can make your own stethoscope by inserting a matchstick onto a shed button. Then place it on the wrist and observe the movements in the matchstick. Children, generally you have heard the word BP. What is BP? BP or blood pressure is the force exerted by the blood against the blood vessels. The blood pressure is measured at the upper arm artery because it is the site of highest distribution of blood and the pressure of the blood is more here. That is why the upper arm is the standard place to know the blood pressure. Children, this is the sphygmomanometer. It is used to check the BP. So, normal human blood pressure is 120/80 millimeter of mercury or mm of Hg. Upper one measures the strongest pressure during the time of blood forced out of the ventricles. It is called systolic pressure. The systolic pressure is about 120 mm of Hg. The lower one measures the when the ventricles are refilled with blood. It is the resting period. This is called diastolic pressure. The diastolic pressure is 80 mm of Hg. BP will change according to the activity of a person like running, resting, walking. If the person is in resting condition, the BP will be normal. If the person is doing any activity, the BP will change it. If a person having high BP in a resting period, he is said to have an hypertension. If the blood pressure is more than the 140/90 mm of Hg, it is considered as high BP or hypertension. If the blood pressure is below the 90/60 mm of Hg, it is called low BP or hypotension. What are the reasons for the high BP? Let us see. Too much salt in the diet, lack of physical activity, too much alcohol consumption and smoking. How to control high BP? Low salt consumption, physical exercise, quit smoking. What are the reasons for the low BP? Dehydration, fall in blood volume, nutritional deficiency, allergic reactions. So, how to control the low BP? Drink more water and eat balanced diet. Children, we know that the blood pumped by the heart received by the arteries and arteries supply blood to the various body parts. From the body parts, veins receives the blood and pumped into the heart, but the course taken by the blood is different in different animals. Let us see. Children, observe the picture. This is the circulation of the fish. Fish has two chambered heart. Heart contains single atrium and single ventricle. The atrium collects deoxygenated blood from the body while ventricle pumps the blood to the gills where the gaseous exchange occurs. That means the blood is reoxygenated. This is called gill circulation. The blood then continues to the rest of the body before arriving back to the atrium. This is called systemic circulation. Here, blood flows through the heart only once to complete one circulation. If the blood flows through the heart only once to complete one circulation, it is called single circulation. This type of circulation is present in animals which are having the two chambered heart. Example, fishes. Children, observe one more picture. The blood from the right ventricle pumped into the pulmonary artery. The blood from the left ventricle pumped into the aorta. The deoxygenated blood which pumped into the pulmonary artery flows towards the lungs where oxygenation takes place. From the lungs, pulmonary vein collects the blood and pumped it to the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood enters into the left ventricle. From there, it enters into the aorta. Aorta divides into arteries and arterioles, we know that. So, the blood from the aorta pumped into the arteries and arterioles and finally reaches the capillaries, where the blood is pumped into the cells or tissues. From the cells or tissues, the veins collect the deoxygenated blood and through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, they can empties into the right atrium. Children, if you see here, to complete one circulation, the blood flows through the heart twice. Once the blood pumped into the lungs for purification, after purification the blood reaches the heart and then the blood supplied to the various body parts, and from there the blood is collected by the veins and emptied into the heart. So, here to complete one circulation, blood flows through the heart twice. If the blood flows through the heart twice for completing one circulation, it is called double circulation. This type of circulation is present in the animals which are having four-chambered heart. Example, birds and mammals. What we have learnt? Rigid blood vessels are arteries which brings blood from heart to body parts. The less rigid blood vessels are veins which brings blood from body parts to heart. Blood capillaries are most microscopic, made of single layer of cells. One contraction and one relaxation of heart is called cardiac cycle. Pulse rate is equal to the heartbeat. Children, improve your learning by solving these questions. If the valves in veins of the legs fail to stop the flow of blood, what could be the consequences of this failure? What is hypertension or high BP? What precautions will you take to avoid high BP? Draw a block diagram to explain single and double circulation. Write differences between them. Children, we have discussed about blood vessels and blood circulation. Let us meet in another sessions of digital lessons. Visit the official website of SCERT for the worksheets of this lesson to improve your learning. Thank you.